Shay, my loves. This is your girl, if it's Queen, coming back at you once again. Tired as hell. Just left Info Man show. It was a great show. Whoever missed it, y'all missed a bomb. Y'all make sure y'all go over there. Holla at my boy now. He always dropping those diamonds over there. It was awesome. One of the best shows ever. But and I told y'all earlier, I was gonna try to get me some rest, but as I always say, I'm divinely guided by the Most High. Yeah, at the talk, I was just talking to y'all about my brother up there in Runner Robbins. And there, if he didn't call me today, that's the one I told you I get along with. I talked to him several times a day, and my cousin and everything. And that was. I'm always happy to hear from my brother, especially just me and him was always tight when I was little. He was in the military. I remember him always sending me things from Korea and all. When he was in Korea, Colorado Springs, Watertown, New York. He always sent us some clothes, something from there. I told you I was just a spoiled brat. But as I say, I'm always guided by the Most High. I was trying to lay me behind down, and as I say, when the Most High speak to me of ancestors and then put something on my mind to do, I must be obedient, my loves. So this is my disclaimer. I hold no rights or anything to this content. It's already copywritten by the Manly P. Hall Society. He is he was one of my favorite. He is my favorite. And then it's C.G. Darling. Then of course Neville Goddard, Alan Watts, Carl Young. Just to name a few. But everyone knows that my channel, my platform is all about all things spiritual. Had a wonderful conversation with my cousin today. Because my brother, I asked him, did he see her? Because she lives up in Renner Robbins too. And he wanted me, I was out driving, and I told him he wanted her number. And I said, well, let me give you. He said, no. If you driving, you wait till you get home and then you text me. So I got here to the house and I called her. Because, I knew it wasn't no problem, but still, that's just my courtesy because everybody don't want you giving out their phone number. And I told her, I said, Jeff, hey, Tina, what's going on? I said, Jeff wants your number. She said, oh, that's fine. Go ahead and give it to him. I also had already been on the phone with her for an hour. I three-wayed my brother back and stayed on there another hour. I said, Lord, have mercy. So this is Manly P. Hall, Ghosts, Visions, and Premonitions. I think this is a fitting topic because I have visions and premonitions. That's what I'm saying because I'm guided when I get a premonition. That's hard for me to explain. It's like if something just pop in my head or I get a voice in my head, I know it ain't nothing but the Most High. My ancestors are sort of talking to me, so that's why I have to heed those words. So that's why I thought this would be a fitting lecture by Manly P. Hall on ghosts, visions, and premonitions.
A rather specialized and perhaps controversial subject this morning. So I'm going to ask you to be a little patient.
Don't forget to hit that like button
as the theme unfolds and to try to think along with the idea in the hope that ultimately we shall arrive at some helpful conclusions.
And this is
in the first.
And I've listened to just about all of his lectures. And here lately they've been releasing some lectures that I haven't seen, and this is one that I haven't seen. So I already know it's going to be fantastic. So those who haven't here, let them hear.
Place we realize that what we call modern science is moving gradually toward a recognition of many spiritual facts and principles which were not considered proper scientific subjects 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. Even in the world of science, materialism per se is gradually losing favor. Yet this shift from one attitude to another cannot be a shift backward into older beliefs and concepts entirely.
Yeah, they blocked that live I did last night with the music. YouTube blocked that motherfucker. They put a big old red block sign on it. I said, damn.
Equipped as we are with certain information which we have never before generally possessed, we must expect our recent findings to affect our convictions on almost every important subject. In the last 20 years, we have expended an incredible sum of money, running into hundreds of billions of dollars, in research along scientific and industrial lines. A great part of this research has been dedicated to defensive military equipment. This tremendous amount of human endeavor, had it been in part at least directed into the study of man himself, might have clarified many issues still hopelessly confused, and could well have made it unnecessary to expend this vast sum upon military armaments of one kind or another. Yet man, by nature and habit, has followed certain inclinations.
You missed a fantastic show over at Information Man. Boy, let me tell you. Straight diamonds.
Which minority groups do not admire, but which they also recognize to be necessary, considering that man is what he is, and we must always work from the foundation that we may not expect from the human being that which is not probable or reasonable. In the search for a spiritual philosophy of life, science is beginning to investigate what we now generally term, rather inadequately, psychological phenomena. This field is also very young, and with the exception of a few strong idealists, it has scattered itself throughout the scientific concept, trying desperately to maintain a scientific foundation for itself, in order that it might not be ridiculed, in order that it might not be regarded as having fallen into some sickly superstition. Psychology also, however, is growing. And because it exists within the tempo of our present life, it is growing more rapidly than might have occurred a century ago. The drift in psychology, like that in the other sciences, is toward a recognition of the tremendous challenge of the internal life of the individual. Many hard, fast convictions are being discarded, and in the search for realities, psychology, philosophy, religion, and in general the scientific bodies are moving definitely in the direction of a cautious idealism. One of the reasons, undoubtedly, is psychic pressure itself. The attitudes which prevailed in times of peace and prosperity or comparative security are not strong enough are not healthy enough, are not vital enough to protect us through this present rather confused and dismal state. So to solve the problem, science is now working consciously or unconsciously toward the clarification of the concept of man's immortality. Now, we might say that this is a rather trivial outlook on the ground that millions of persons already have this conviction and cannot understand why others do not share it as they themselves feel it to be inevitably true. Yet science, by its very nature, cannot accept things merely assumed or held by conviction. Science must search constantly for proof, either physical proof or logical evidence. There is no question that science itself is changing its attitude toward proof, beginning to accept reason as a valid instrument of judgment. Things essentially reasonable, and against which no body of evidence stands to prove that they are not reasonable, are gaining validity out of a kind of proving which arises within thought itself. This proving, however, must be cautious, as man's enthusiasm and his natural addiction to his own beliefs may cause him to be more emotional than reasonable in the bringing in of evidence. We may also feel that this long, lumbering road of the reasonable should be cut as Alexander cut the Gordian knot. But remember, we are moving in a period and in a world in which facts are being sought as never before, and that the factual approach is being so widely diversified and so widely diffused that young people growing up in this generation will be more fact conscious than any other generation we have ever known. Now, what are the facts in this particular subject? In the course of years,
Loves it. Baby boy, when you do a live, you go hard in the paint, don't you? You believe in doing 12, 15, 17. I can go to sleep, wake up, go to sleep, wake up next morning, and you still going strong.
it's been my pleasure or misfortune sometimes to discuss problems of this nature with many groups, including so-called atheists and out-and-out agnostics. Most of these persons are not actually positively disbelievers. They are rather individuals who are unable to adjust traditional concepts, medieval attitudes, with the motion of modern times. Most of these unbelievers have fallen over some theological stumbling block. They have been unable to reconcile the dawn of knowledge, their own increasing insight, with certain beliefs which remain essentially medieval or even ancient. Also, many of these persons are perfectly willing to realize that ancient beliefs have become worsened by interpretation, that many principles in themselves, perhaps true, have become so encrusted with centuries of superstition or ecclesiastical embellishments that the original beliefs, the original ideas are practically lost to us. I believe, therefore, that materialism in general is not a revolution against a belief in the reality of God or the immortality of the human soul. but rather a rebellion against interpretations, a rebellion against beliefs that no longer seem to be suitable, no longer seem to be acceptable to us. And perhaps one of the most common examples of this is the attitude of modern man toward hell. This whole concept of eternal damnation has simply lost interest to him. He no longer believes it. He no longer can believe it. And he has turned from the entire body of religion because of this particular element within its structure. Modern religious movements are beginning to recognize that this doctrine is no longer helpful. It no longer protects any of the values of life. It infuriates more than it assists. A modern man, viewing life as he does, is inclined to favor materialism when confronted with this other alternative. Yet this other alternative is itself interpretational. We have no more actual evidence to sustain one than we have the other. And it is just as difficult to prove the reality of hell as it is to attempt to prove the unreality of God. These problems remain in a great field of abstract speculations. And modern man, searching for religious strength and consolation, is more concerned with positive aspects of believing than he is with the ancient negative fears that once perhaps contributed something to his morality. Also approaching the modern attitude, the tendency today is to assume that when we finally solve this problem, it will have to remain solved. That we must now move from inevitable interpretations and the conflicts of religious belief to some firm and enduring foundation of worship. That this foundation of worship demands a bigness in ourselves that we have not been able to, as yet, fully appreciate. Science will never be able to prove the spiritual validity of sectarianism. It will never be able to prove that one religious conviction is good and all others are wrong. Science has no interest in proving this. Either the subject must be solved basically, or it can never be solved scientifically. This does not mean, however, that man, having come to certain knowledge, will then sit back and continue to practice this knowledge for the rest of the great evolutionary cycle. This is not implied. It is implied, however, that the next foundation must be secure. It must be one upon which man can build, and by which his growing knowledge will no longer be assailed by improbabilities. He will always be in search of more knowledge, but he must not be in a position in which each new discovery must force him to discard the greater part of his already accumulated conviction. Thus, to clarify this conviction, to place it on a basis in which it can grow without being locked in some kind of a struggle with counter convictions. This is a very important and desirable aspect of the subject from a scientific point of view. It is not that we should know all, but that what we should know should be essentially sound. Now, the only way in which this can be achieved is through the direction of tremendous resources upon the subject of breaking through the prevailing opinionism, sifting out the facts honestly, and gradually moving our spiritual convictions onto an essentially honest basis. Now, the individual with his convictions may be personally very honest. He may live in every respect as near to his beliefs as it is possible for the frailty of the flesh to accomplish. Yet if these convictions themselves are not adequate, they do not supply the person with the strength, the directives, and the confidence necessary to work out his own life with the greatest efficiency. So what we are searching for, both scientifically and religiously, and on the scientific level, especially psychologically, is this firm ground, this discovery of one or two essential principles which are not likely to change, and upon which we can then begin to build increasing penetration and knowledge and substance relating to the spiritual life of ourselves. In psychology, a number of discoveries have been made, and these discoveries have in many instances involved material previously regarded as religious. For example, it has involved the visions of saints and mystics. It has involved various types of clairvoyant and psychic phenomena. And it has also come into contact with the extrasensory perception gamut and related fields. 1,000 years ago, all of these subjects were totally religious. And interior experience, particularly of a mystical nature, together with certain phenomenal experiences such as visions, portenting dreams, and things of that nature, were regarded as the best source of proof of the immortality of the human soul. In other words, most persons' convictions about immortality are based either upon some inner instinct, which is strong and irrepressible, or upon historical evidence derived from the lives of mystical philosophers, spiritual teachers, and world saviors. These evidences are now, many of them, within the field of psychology rather than essentially the field of religion. Psychology, therefore, to go on, has to go into religion. And religion, to go on, has to begin to consider the psychological evidence. That this consideration is being mutually given, we also find to be factual today. We find the introduction of pastoral counseling into churches. We find a work on psychology for the priests under the imprimatur of the Archbishop of Quebec, speaking for the Catholic world. We find that these motions of ideas cannot be stopped. They are moving distinctly, forming bridges, forming patterns of relationship between fields otherwise and previously totally isolated. In this concept also, then, the study of immortality must develop upon a basis in which it is not necessary to fall into certain beliefs or attitudes no longer held as reasonable. Now we may say this is audacity and follow the ancient concept that with God all things are possible. But evidence now indicates, both scientifically and religiously, that with God all things are reasonable. That instead of thinking in terms of the continuance of inexplicable mystery, the universe is becoming a little less mysterious. It is full of mysteries, but these mysteries are no longer regarded as something magical, something transcending knowledge, something contrary to all laws and all common sense, nor as something so actually and completely recondite that no human being dare to approach it. these concepts are vanishing, and we are beginning to sense that the universe is a type of thing that does not have to be reticent about being explored, that the individual is not unreligious because he seeks for facts. He is not sacrilegious because he dares to believe that the sovereign power at the root of life wants him to know, rather than wants him to remain ignorant. Building upon this basic value, we then begin to search for an explanation of life, a seeking after life and its laws, its truths, and its principles, which can be reconciled with religion, philosophy, and science. Calling all three of these to the fullest use of their resources, and recognizing that the total discovery cannot be made without the coordination of these three powerful factors. These are the three legs of the great tripodium of Delphi, from which came the oracle of the gods. In studying this matter, we begin to feel also that it is no longer going to be a complete choice between one belief or another. Looking around us, we cannot say with certainty that any of the interpretations that we now possess is adequate. This does not mean that we discard these other beliefs. We must first of all begin to recognize that we have never known these beliefs. We have known only our own attitude toward them. We have never really explored these beliefs reasonably. Those which were strange or dissimilar, we rejected empirically, or perhaps experimented with as a dilettante, wondering what they were all about. Those we did believe and accept, we also accepted empirically, simply on the belief or on the assumption that what we accept is true. This kind of approach means that nearly all religions in the world have been sold short by their own followers. These religions have not enjoyed the thoughtfulness to which they were entitled. Instead of trying to understand, man has passed through cycles of acceptance and rejection, resulting rather in fanaticism than enlightenment. This situation will also change because man's attitude toward religion is no longer to be one of complete wonder, of prostration before the unknown. It is man's realization today that he is gradually but inevitably forming a fraternal relationship with the universe, that he must ultimately become a powerful agent in the outworkings of the divine plan. And for this he must understand and must know and must have adequate spiritual insight. That such insight is possible, no one denies. That such insight has been neglected, everyone knows. So in searching on these grounds, we do not wish to for one instant detract from the dignity of man's spiritual questing, but to point out that in our modern world, mere dignity is not any longer a substitute for reality, and that worship as we have known it has not served our purpose as it should, has not prevented war, crime, delinquency, poverty, as it should have done, simply because man himself did not approach the subject correctly. We must either assume that the heavenly worlds are weak or that man is weak. And it is a safer assumption in the face of irrefutable evidence that the weakness rests with man and not with heaven. Therefore, it is high time for man to strengthen his point of view and strengthen his understanding of value. The search for immortality has been largely based upon a level of symbolism. This level of symbolism divided the world into two hemispheres, one visible and one invisible. These two hemispheres we call the life and death faces of life itself. Immortality assumes the continuance of life in the dark, unknown hemisphere and follows somewhat in the old Egyptian belief that the sun at night, riding its ship across the sea of heaven, when it descended in the west and disappeared from our view, ascended in the underworld and continued to light the souls of the deceased for the following interval of hours until the sunrise in our sphere again. There is some question whether we shall be able to physically and scientifically justify this position. It is somewhat unlikely also that we shall be able to justify the Egyptian belief that the rich farmer passing into the other life as a reward for his virtue was awarded a particularly fertile area of 40 acres alongside of the celestial Nile with adequate equipment, a fine team of oxen, and was therefore able to get 2 crops a year by alternating for the rest of eternity. This was originally a symbolic thinking, and man gradually made it so literal that he proceeded to offend other men with his literality, with his literalness of approach. It will no longer be possible to assume that what we call heaven is some form of after-death wonderland in which the individual will live on as he has here and will at the same time live on in a location, a place. And in this place will be gathered all that went before him. Man archetypally has developed this notion. Therefore, it has to mean something. But it has to mean something different from what we have assumed it to mean, because we can no longer actually find in these explanations the solution to our own living. We can no longer follow the ancient Nordic belief that the after-death state of heroes was that they would feast all night and fight all day. This thinking meant something. What did it mean? It meant heaven as the great compensation for the inadequacy of life here. It was the individual feeling convinced that all that he could not accomplish here, he would accomplish there, and that any joys denied him here would be accorded him there. And around this was tied the string of morality by means of which he had to earn this better state by his life here. There are principles in this that are essentially true, but the interpretation of these principles has led gradually to so literal, so physically posited an attitude toward the afterlife that modern thinking, particularly of a scientific nature, simply cannot accept such an attitude or such conclusions. The rebellion, therefore, against God has been rebellion against an interpretation of God. And today, instead of continuing this rebellion, men have awakened to the need for the reorganization of their own interpretive powers. They must begin to discover a deeper, fuller, wiser, more purposeful answer to the question of their own future existence. Until they have accomplished this, we will continue to drift in a state of half believing. Now, what seems to emerge as an answer to some of these problems? And I think perhaps here the first step does tie in with psychological research into psychic phenomena. It has gradually become evident that a great many mysteries that were assumed to originate in space originate actually within the deeper space dimensions of man. That man himself, as we explore further and further into the root of his being, becomes the solution to a great many mysteries that he regarded as entirely independent from himself. We know, for example, that it is perfectly possible by psychological means to duplicate practically any form of psychical phenomena with which we are presently concerned. The only possible exceptions would be those which involve actual physical transformation or animation of inanimate objects. But almost everything that we have previously known and have regarded as a purely religious mystery can now be induced in one way or another. Any psychologist, by use of suggestive therapeutic means, can induce a vision. He can cause another person to see almost anything conceivable. He can cause another person not only to see, but to hear. And he can go so far as to cause that other person to reach out and touch and feel something that has no existence except as a thought. This recognition leads inevitably to a correlative. If one person can do this to another, and already research indicates the value of this correlative, it is also proven and demonstrated that the individual can do it to himself. Just as surely as he can come under the influence of an outside individual, he can come equally and powerfully under the influence of an aspect of his own character. He can come under the pressure of his own mind. He can induce within himself phenomena which appears to be outside of himself. He can also induce this phenomena in a manner in which it mingles with facts until it is apparently impossible to disassociate them. And by the common use of his senses and faculties, he cannot distinguish between them. Under a certain type of induced psychological or hypnotic condition, an individual will see what he is told to see. Later, remembering this, he is confronted with a very serious dilemma. He must sometime accept the fact that what he sees is not necessarily true. The sight has always been our first line of defense against illusion. We say, if it's there and I saw it, my friend saw it, it's so. Here again we are in a dangerous spot, because even things seen may not be so. And things seen inwardly, in trances or visions or dreams, may very well not be so. They may very well be archetypal symbols, or they merely represent pressures of the individual himself, personalizing energies of his own nature, and causing certain of his fixations, attitudes, and neuroses to take shape. These symbolic shapes are recorded constantly in ancient experience. And we look back with considerable misgiving upon an age of witchcraft, in which for centuries men plagued themselves and each other with the actual belief that certain demoniacal creatures could be evoked at crossroads at night, that these monsters could appear over the heads of the dying. They were seen. The dying person saw them. Others claimed to see them. And at the height of the pressure, nearly everyone saw them. And because these things were seen, no one dared to doubt them. And we were not yet well enough equipped in our knowledge of psychological principles to realize that this was a delusion of masses. That these things create within the individual a tremendous visualizing power, and that he does not necessarily retain awareness of this visualizing circumstance. We know, for example, today, that there would be a group of persons who could distinguish between an internal vision and an external incident. The individual can say, well, certain things could be dreams. They may be meaningful dreams. They could be visions. But we know that they occur within ourselves, and therefore they belong to a certain type of phenomenon. This same person, however, would be confused if instead of this vision appearing within him, he was first aware of it as something completely external to himself. He would say, if it is external to myself, I cannot be the cause of it. If I have a vision in which I am in a room with 20 other people, and suddenly the door of that room opens and a person I know to be deceased comes through that door, then I am seeing something outside of myself. Yet psychologically, this phenomena can be produced. In a room with 50 real living people, an imaginary person can be introduced by psychological tension and caused to come in, walk around, and shake hands with people who are there. Remember, however, that this is only in reference to an individual. One person can see this. The person in whose psychic life the vision or the psychological circumstance has been induced. And this has been almost always the story of these situations, that visions are visible to one person, although occasionally you will get a mass situation where it is known today that the same vision, or approximately that vision, can be induced in 50 or 100 persons at one time. But each person goes through the chemistry of induction himself. The final recognition from this is that the person is continuously inducing various phenomena. Usually, the circumstances are not strong enough or great enough for this induction to take on what you might term miraculous proportions. The individual is content merely to induce prejudices or to induce within himself areas of blindness in which rationally he will reject whole areas of ideas because they disagree with him. Also, he will be induced to dramatically reject what he does not want to believe, or to equally dramatically accept that which he wants to accept. These are the minor types of induced pressures. It is only under certain conditions, under certain intensities, that we will go beyond this point. But these intensities themselves may be of several kinds. They can arise from a purely mental situation, or they can arise from a physical condition, as, for example, the hallucinations of alcoholism or narcotics addiction. We discover that the individual, under certain types of advanced alcoholism, will in delirium tremens actually be plagued, tormented by creatures which he can see, but which have no existence except in himself. Now, we tried for a while to solve this by assuming that these creatures had other existence. That these creatures or that corresponding forces may have psychological entity is true. But their appearance to us at any given time must very largely be the result of our own condition, our own attitude. This does not necessarily mean that a mystical experience is impossible, but it also supposes rather strongly that this mystical experience is a degree of understanding, a degree of enlightenment, a degree of apatheism, which the person still clothes in his own psychological materials. Not long ago in Japan, a very devout person had a wonderful vision. In this wonderful vision, practically every phase of this vision could be likened to one of the great and beautiful temple paintings of that country. In an emergency, in great need, in great stress, this individual called for spiritual help and guidance. And this help and guidance moved in the visual form of Amida Butsu, the great hope, the spiritual consolation of this people. On another occasion, the same type of thing could occur and has occurred in Europe, in America, and in other parts of the world. And when this vision moved in the moment of great stress, it moved in the form of Jesus or one of the saints. In the Muslim world, the same thing happens. The same need arises. The same human emergency exists. And under these conditions, the person seeking help may, as in the case of Jalaluddin, see the wall of his little room open, and one of the great ones, one of the masters of mysteries, in his green robes and turban, might come through the door or through the wall and appear to the believer with the full spiritual intensity of impact, which changed the life of Jalaluddin and made him dedicate his entire career to the religious service of his fellow men. So whether it be the vision of a little Japanese woman seeing her blessed Amida appear to her, or whether it be the vision of St. Francis de Assisi, the crying of the soul in need produces phenomena. It produces something that comes with the tremendous impact of inner reality. But this impact is always clothed in familiar symbolism. So to each of these people, solution comes through that which is nearest to themselves, nearest to their common believing, and in accordance with the religion and insight which they already possess. Under such situations, I believe the overtone is obvious. That all of these persons receive direct spiritual help.
Me too.
And that this direct spiritual help was the result of further understanding of value. That this experience in each case was a revelation which contributed to reintegration, reorganization of spiritual resource. We know this is so. We know also that the content in all of these cases was ethically identical. We realize that the solution to the problem was the same for all peoples. But it was the voice that spoke that differed, not the substance of the message. It was the being seen that was in different robes, or of a different race, or of a different faith. But the ideas were not different. if psychology really catches on to this fact, it will probably go through a series of experimental changes. Its first effort will, of course, be to thereby indicate that the individual has created his own religion. This would, for the moment, seemingly support a materialistic position, namely that all spiritual instruction is auto-hypnotic. But a little further research will reveal something else, namely that the substance of this instruction arises not in an individual, nor in any group of individuals, but arises in the common experience of life itself. Therefore, that this experience is actually a revelation toward that which is eternally true. That it is not the substance that arose within the individual, because man does not possess reality. Reality possesses man. It is only the moving in of this reality upon our consciousness that requires the elaborate symbolical devices that we have used for ages. Psychology will ultimately, therefore, come to realize that these visions, these archetypal appearances, are only possible because behind them is a universal availability of truth. Otherwise, they could not come to the individual. It is not the truth that man manufactures. It is merely a way of becoming aware of the truth. Because this awareness must be understandable to him. And the problem of the presentation of knowledge in a manner most acceptable and producing the most immediate dynamic upon the life of the individual, this process means that it must be clothed in some form, symbolical or otherwise, which is immediately apperceivable by that person and comes in a form in which this impact has the greatest probability of creating the necessary changes in life or temperament. So psychology will move on past this problem of the different religions, each having the same meaning, but each appearing with a different symbolic structure. Gradually, we will come to know, therefore, that all religions are symbolic structures existing in times and places, necessary to man because of an eternal hunger in his own nature, but useful to man at any given time only because he can accept and understand them, which means that these statements have to be in the terms of familiar things. Religions are therefore one truth presented in terms familiar to different peoples. As soon as we can really understand this and begin to sense it as a scientific fact, supported by an increasing body of psychological evidence, we will begin to overcome one of the great wastes that we have in life, namely the waste of energy in religious controversy. We shall also overcome one of the great intervals which separate human beings today. For if we can realize that the differences are like the differences of dress and language, having no essential effect upon the validity of content, we shall then begin to realize what we have always observed and should have always known, namely that there can be but one ethics in nature. There can be only one code. And as we are able to approach this code more and more directly and understand it more effectively and recognize with greater clarity its inevitable need, we shall begin to practice virtues that we now only talk about. The next point then is to recognize that in all of these different faiths and beliefs, there are attitudes concerning the after-death state of man. These attitudes are, for the most part, also identical. There are certain minor differences. Perhaps in some things they do not appear to be quite as orderly and systematic as in other more obvious levels. But the survival of consciousness in some way, in some condition or state, is the common belief of persons of good faith throughout the world. This belief is also founded upon a certain quality of interior experience. We become aware of the eternality of our own souls through mere contemplation of our own life content. We cannot conceive or imagine the end of this content. Everything that we know that is reasonable impels us to assume that nature in her economy does not create things merely to annihilate them, and that the long and tortuous path of man's growth could certainly not end in limbo. We have these rational convictions to sustain us. We also again have visions, experiences, telepathic communications, spectral appearances of the dead. And these things have existed since the dawn of time. And we have had these convictions ever since Saul stood in the presence of the witch of Endor. This type of experience, again, however, comes under your psychological heading. And we are not always certain whether these things that we see inwardly or outwardly have in themselves a truth as we see them, or whether they are the projection of well-remembered appearances, whether they represent some level or phase of our own consciousness. But these levels or phases, whatever they may be, frequently come to us in great need in our moment of doubt or fear, and such appearances are particularly frequent to those who are approaching transition from one life to another. That these things arise from roots, and that these roots have their proper meanings and explanations, we cannot deny. That all that exists and factually has meaning, or functionally actually occurs, has some relationship to a plan, to an organized fact in the universe. And the search for this fact, the effort to discover the lineaments of this frame or pattern, these things we have to work with, and they are part of the challenge of our modern scientific quest after fact. The problem that has beset many persons in these matters also is the infinite diversity of man's need. It is utterly inconceivable to us and to science and to psychology that an abode can exist beyond the mortal world which can be regarded as satisfactory to the infinite type and variety of beings that are flowing into it continuously. It is incredible to us that the enormous mass of mankind, utterly divided in this world as to interests, as to levels of accomplishment, as to beliefs, as to races and nations and languages, should by the simple process of translation to another life suddenly become utterly and completely compatible and able to advance their causes in a one heaven state. We can only assume from our common observation here that what would be heaven to one person would not be heaven to another. That some individuals pass out of this life with nothing on their mind but the hope for rest. Others with nothing but a desire to work. Some leave with a conviction that they are going to continue their present courses. Others that they are doing the opposite from here on. These diversities can only be theoretically reconciled on the assumption that death, in some mysterious way, brings all things into harmonious relationships. That the individual, by the experience of death and the recognition of his own immortality after death, suddenly becomes absolutely compatible with everyone else. This is a long hope and a rather unscientific approach to a subject. Also, there are innumerable other very difficult hurdles to cross in trying to think through an after state that would not violate the facts we have here, and at the same time would be equitable to all concerned. Unless we are able, through our researches, to discover an honest universe, we have failed utterly. Man, because he is not too honest, but would like to be more so, worships or reveres the very honesty that he does not find the strength or inclination to practice. In the long analysis of things, we remember most those who were our truest benefactors. Perhaps in their own day we crucified them, but in the course of ages, men have indicated that they respect virtue even though they cannot practice it. So that in our subconscious searching for reality, we must find a beautiful reality. We must find a noble reality and a virtuous reality. If we cannot find these things, we do not even wish to seek. We wish nothing more that constitutes disillusionment. Yet if we believe that this universe has any principle of reason in it, if it is controlled by a power possessing intellect, insight, understanding, wisdom, beauty, faith, or love, then the state as it is must be good, whether we know it or not. The fact that we cannot discover this good in no way alters its dimensions or proportions. It must exist. Man, therefore, must also possess the faculty to discover the good, to discriminate between things that seem to be good or bad for a time, and those other things which have a goodness in eternity, have a reality and a surviving beyond the limitations of the changing and shifting patterns of human society. The search, then, for the beautiful good, what my old friend Claude Bragdon called the beautiful necessity, borrowing in his turn from Emerson. This concept means that our understanding of the larger universal life must be our discovery of the beautiful necessity, of that which has to be in order to sustain the meaning of anything. Modern research is indicating more and more the fact of meaning. We are discovering as we go, slowly it is true, that things are meaningful, more meaningful than we ever suspected. And we are discovering that the shallowness is not in things, but in ourselves. And therefore our growth is the deepening of our own nature and our own understanding. With these realizations in mind, we also begin to search for more knowledge of man's constitution on the invisible side of life. What survives? If man as a being has an existence beyond present existing conditions, what is it that has this subsistence? To what degree does body change or alter the proportions and relations of consciousness. Is the loss of body the simple wiping out of physical existence? Is it that the individual seems to awaken from a dream, or rather perhaps from a sleep that ceases to be meaningful in dreams? Does the person simply discover a world ending in himself and his own being going on? Is it as though he closes a door behind him? Does his own existence enlarge? What actually happens to him? Let us assume for a moment that which seems to be the simplest and safest of the assumptions, and probably nearer to the philosophic and scientific approach than anything else we can immediately advance. Let us assume then that the individual, moving from one sphere to another, changes place but not state. Here in our present life, man's real source of his total existence is his own interior consciousness. This consciousness is also his link with universal consciousness. And the divine power which he worships in nature, he experiences in himself. Therefore, in himself, he creates himself. And more we know psychologically that the happy man is merely the man who has found happiness in himself. The unhappy man, the one who has found unhappiness in himself. That practically every emotional condition in which we can exist, or any mental situation in which we can find ourselves, that these arise from adjustments within ourselves. It must be so. Otherwise, there can be no integrity in the universe. If any individual is the victim of exteriors, of situations which he cannot control, then there can be no law or order in space. There has to be a relationship between the individual and circumstances which preserves the integrity of the universe. Otherwise, we are confronted with a continuing dishonesty in which each person has within himself the capacity to make others miserable, and ultimately to be made miserable by others. Now, in our visible life, we know that we make people miserable, and we know that other people make us miserable. But we also know that this has to be a more or less empiric fact, one based upon observation, upon the use of faculties themselves not correct or not entirely true, or reasoning from an inadequate premise, in which we do the best we can with what we believe, but our believing is not big enough to solve the problem honestly. This type of thinking must come gradually into our nature. And it has to lead us ultimately to the position that was taken by Buddhism 2,500 years ago. Namely, that the individual must finally stand as the cause of his own good and the cause of his own evil. That good and evil cannot be regarded as arbitrarily bestowed by God or circumstances. And modern science will not accept this arbitrary bestowal. All these things must have a ground in common sense. And common sense in this case follows the golden rule exactly. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. The golden rule is either true or it is not true. If it is true, then it must be applicable wherever the appearance of dishonesty or favoritism shows itself in our living. Fighting, therefore, to find out these facts and to move according to them, we come to the core problem of man's survival. Man's survival in any other condition must have a certain ratio to his survival in this condition. Assuming that he does not have a body, this simply means that he is cut off from bodily association with a sphere of life. Having no bridge to it any longer, he cannot share it, partake of it, or actually be acutely conscious of it, except perhaps under certain special conditions within his own life. Perhaps his contact with this world after death is by means of certain faculties and perceptions that can be developed in him, just as here, through the development or possession of such extra faculty powers, he may become aware of another world in which he does not now have a continuing conscious existence. The principle involved is, however, that man going into a state beyond the present state falls into what we might almost term the mystery maze of his own soul, moving inward towards his own source. As exterior faculties or powers drop away, the individual suddenly discovers that his life is the life of a psychic entity, that his life is the life of a being, and that he is already experiencing that life here, but does not presently regard it as the sovereign reality. Just as today we know that our psychological pressures are arising from within ourselves, from a submerged level that we are now exploring, a level which we will ultimately discover to have its own anatomy and physiology. So surely, the most reasonable and probable answer to the state of man after death is that he merely continues upon the level of his psychic entity, that the being behind the body actually represents the surviving self, that the person no longer embodied is the person that we must now reach for by going into our own subjective. But once having cast off body, this bridge is no longer necessary. We are our own subjective. And the moment we recognize a continuance in this state, we also recognize the tremendous symbolical and archetypal significance of this continuance. We realize that this continuance is not necessarily geographical, nor is it necessarily a place as we have come to think. It is a continuance in self. And this continuance in self can be and is a highly dramatic series of incidents, values which can be of the greatest importance to us. This would also fit perfectly into the Oriental concept of rebirth and karma, because particularly in the case of karma, or compensation, the individual meeting the debts of life, the purgatorial concept of the ancient. This concept is nothing more or less than something we already taste here without realizing exactly its full implication. Suppose we take the person here who cannot live with himself, who must constantly turn on the television or rush in to see the neighbors. The person who has no ability to know himself, who finds association with himself dull and disillusioning, who also finds that it is intolerable after a while. and discovers perhaps likewise that if he is too much alone, he becomes morbid, or he becomes lonesome, or he begins to think too much about unpleasant things. And from loneliness in our present state comes fear and worry and anxiety, persecution complexes, bitterness, jealousies, and innumerable negative reactions, simply because the person is not able to endure himself in a pleasant, compatible, companionable manner. Suppose then that what we term death is merely the individual moving into this subjective field, which he now only touches in his loneliness. Supposing he has to live there. What more immediate and natural method would there be to bringing a complete sense of value? Where could justice be better performed? Where could fate, leaving out all its miraculous values or factors, administer justice and compensation more directly than by simply taking the position that we are what we have made ourselves, and now we have to live with what we are? This then would be a reasonable, natural state of affairs, and a concept of immortality built around such a pattern could not be regarded as superstition or unreasonable or resulting in some glorification of a belief or an opinion. We know now what happens when people live with themselves. We know that to some persons this is a blessed privilege, to others it is a fearful possibility. Yet these persons take these attitudes because of their own conduct, because of the degree of insight they have or have not. Sometimes by the neglect of conduct, sometimes by lack of discrimination, nearly always by lack of self-discipline, the individual is in an impoverished psychological condition. If he must live with his own impoverishment, what greater inducement can there be for enrichment? That the individual may have this type of fuller experience of need. How more naturally and directly could nature continuously remind us of the need for self-improvement? And how could we create such a concept, and how can we sustain it without the inevitable recourse to the doctrine of rebirth? We're having, after death, discovered a need. How are we going to work out that need? How are we going to justify the inevitable fact that nature does not devise failures, and that nature's purpose and end is that all things shall complete their perfect works? Therefore, nature, to make this possible, to preserve the endless courses of growth, must escape from the man-made attitudes of special privileges, vicarious opportunities. Nature is working only to achieve the end, and that end includes in its structure man's compatibility with his own inner life, which we would call health. Also, we now begin to discover the moral reason why certain codes have been established among men, codes that have as their basic value that man shall get along with himself. Now, the code is not always so written. It may often appear to be written so that man can get along with other men, that he can fulfill his own social duties, and that he shall keep the rules of an organized society. But in every instance, the achievement of the social end depends upon the individual achievement. It is only the person who conquereth himself who can make the proper social adjustment. It is only the person who has discovered value within who can understand the needs and the proprieties of union with other persons for the advancement of common causes. Thus, the entire program of insight in this world the whole concept of life itself as therapy, the whole concept of life as universal education. These concepts all build around the existence of a permanent conscious entity of some nature or kind, or an unconscious but enduring principle, by means of which no experience can be lost. Nothing necessary for the advancement of anything can fail, but that all things, consciously or unconsciously, are building in the substance and essence of their own perfection. With this type of thinking, we have a strong case for the kind of immortality that we know is necessary to the advancement of both private and public cause. We know also that by means of this approach to the subject, we are able to prove the validity of certain scientific, psychological procedures, and also to enthusiastically hope that these procedures will be improved, will continue to unfold until they can make a vital therapeutic contribution to the overall understanding of man on the total problem of his existence. If we are able to advance some of these causes, we shall achieve a great deal of good. Incidentally, on the same problem level, we find archetypally coming out of man a continual flow of valuable symbolic information. This continual flow of information is moved by pressure. Now, the individual who has comparatively slight pressures, who is not inhibited, who is not frustrated, who is not neurotic, who has not developed extraordinary or excessive escape mechanisms of any kind, nor is obviously troubled with defense mechanisms. Such a person is regarded as existing in reasonably good health. And the reason why he is reasonably well is because he is reasonably compatible with himself. This type of person can live with himself. If he could not live with himself, stress would set in. And if there is no stress, there is on the level of his existence compatibility with his own psychic life. Thus we observe that such a person is not usually subject to elaborate psychological symbolism. Not having negative pressures, he does not create terrifying or morbid or grotesque patterns in dreams or in other experiences of a similar nature. This means that his psychic content is not plaguing him. It also follows that this situation must become more universal. The individual whose psychic life does not plague him is the one who is already adjusted as a citizen to a larger state of existence. This person can move into his own psychic subconscious and be happy there, because his naturally optimistic attitudes, psychologically expressed, will create visualizations as they do in this world. We sometimes wonder how people can be happy in a dismal situation. Someone said not long ago, I just don't see how anyone can even smile anymore. Well, if you want to think a certain way, you could soon see why they felt as they do. But you would also gradually discover that that kind of thinking would make you sick. Therefore, as nature does not have as its primary purpose to make anyone sick, that thinking is not good. You then discover that the kind of world you live in depends upon your understanding of that world. The more you understand that world, and the more you are able to organize a direct campaign of helpfulness without all forms of negative bewilderment, almost to that degree your usefulness will be measured. And that is the same problem in connection with transitional situations. The person who has achieved a kind of real integration here will have that integration when he goes, unless that integration is too completely physical. Realizing that the physical world or life is the thing that at least temporarily he is abandoning. Too much emphasis upon that entire, and too little emphasis upon those principles upon which even our physical life depends, can cause a troublous situation. So psychology, by its positive approach, must recognize ultimately that its end is not merely the exhaustion of psychic stress on the physical plane, but the re-education of the entity on a psychological plane. It has to be that the physical result is dependent from a cause sufficient. And it is the correction, the positive correction of cause, by the enrichment of the psychic life, that the individual is brought into harmonious relationship, by means of which he can face the future with a truly good hope. Psychic phenomena bearing upon this gives us the recognition that we do create inside and project the aspects of our own needs, that we are in the presence of a continuous language flowing out from our own subjective life, and that this language has to be read symbolically in a new way. That we have to recognize that these psychic experiences are statements of our psychological needs, and also under some conditions will bear witness to psychological abnormalities which have to be corrected. The problem of premonition, which also very often comes with this, is once more a psychological pressure, or can be. And this phase of it must be examined before it is completely neglected, and we assume that it is something else. Premonition is insight. Premonition is not only a clairvoyant power, but we shall probably discover is ultimately a rational process. If man's faculties were completely correct, normally and orderly developed, we would not be deceived by anything. We would know with almost certainty everything that is going to occur, particularly within a comparatively small radius of our own existence. We would know exactly the effects of causes that we are setting in motion. We would recognize distinctly symptoms in other persons by which we might be able to detect the next incidents or circumstances likely to occur to them. The facts of things are written on them, but we have not the wit to read the writing. But as our own insight clears, we become aware that there can only be one reasonable answer to any group of symbols or symptoms, which are kinds of symbolism. We would know that certain ways of thought and action must lead to certain inevitable results. And premonition is very often the law of cause and effect taking over and telling us the truth, when it is something completely contrary to our expectancy. If our premonitions are wrong, and the events do not transpire or the circumstances do not come to pass, then it means that our interpretation of symbolism has been wrong. A mistake which is common, because insight on these matters is much more rare than a mistake. But if this insight exists, it is again inviting us to the recognition of facts, that in this universe there are laws, and that these laws do operate, that man's eternal nature is in existence in and with these laws, and that his continuance in his evolutionary procedure is preserved, made possible, and advanced by the fact that he is a continually organized creature. A small part of his interior organization has been revealed to us. Much more must be discovered. But the further we go, the more certainly we will discover that man is a rational organization, that he is a factual scientific structure, and that visibly and invisibly he unfolds according to inflexible and inevitable rules, and that the entire process of life for him is the correct interpretation of symbols in the terms of the symbols of existence, and that his great tragedy is self-delusion, and that as long as he misinterprets or blocks the power of interpretation, he will be surrounded by phantoms that afflict him. But the moment he clarifies the situation within himself, these phantoms are dissolved by interpretation, and we discover that every one of these negative situations is a form of instruction, pointing out not a revengefulness of deity, but an inadequacy in ourselves that must be corrected. Because the final effect of the correction of ourselves is that we live in an adjusted universe, and that we live in a universe which is essentially and substantially good to each and all of us, according to the nature of our own particular works and attributes. But the miserable universe is simply a symbolic misinterpretation in which man allows his own inaptitudes to cause his own misery to appear to be universal. Each person has to solve this problem for himself. And as he solves it, he discovers that he has an entity within himself with which to solve it. And that it is this self-solving entity that is his immortal life. And that in this problem, this entity must continue to exist until solution is achieved. When that solution is achieved, the future lies beyond our present comprehension. We cannot postulate that which we cannot experience, but we assume that the road of evolution or growth applies in the case of man principally to the psychic life, which is revealing itself and unfolding itself to us more every day, and that the conquest of the soul in man and its organization into the purposes for which it was created, that this is the next scientific step, and that it must be taken with the full help and cooperation of enlightened philosophy and dedicated religion. These working together will help us to put man on an understood basis. And from that point on, we can work with him because we know him. Whereas today, we work with what he appears to be, and we are never sure whether we are helping or not. I believe this is the direction on which this subject is almost certainly going to turn as the years that lie ahead come into their fulfillment. Well, time's up, so they'll have to stop some more.
Well, my loves, this has been your girl, Everest Queen. If y'all enjoyed this content, give your girl a thumbs up. Leave me a comment in the box below. Share, subscribe, and as always, go within so you never go without.